Hi, welcome to the ChicoBag podcast. I'm Andy Keller, and on this podcast, we talk about change and how to make the world a better place. And today, I'm happy to be joined by Jay Golden. He's the founder of Retellable and author of the book Retellable: How Your Essential Stories Unlock Power and Purpose. So, Jay's work helps leaders and organizations uncover, shape, and share stories that stick. Stories built on what he calls the journey curve and a clear 6 step framework that turns insight into influence. So, Jay, welcome to the program.
Great to be here. Good to see you, Andy.
So, tell me a little bit about your book and your framework, and I'd like to hear more about this.
Well, the essence of a great story is one that truly reveals change from how the world was to how the world can be. And so my work, since we met a couple of decades ago in this work, I realized with leaders that for all the media that we're creating, for all the social media, those essential stories, those key moments of our lives, those bits of wisdom that we carry with us often are not translated and shared in the ways they can be to have optimal impact. And so I kind of threw off the digital reins and went fully analog about 16 years ago, and have been focused on helping leaders, CEOs, entrepreneurs, nonprofit leaders, movement leaders to truly gather their lives, to distill their insights, and then look at them again and work to translate them into retellable stories. And the idea of a retellable story is it's truly the litmus test. After 100,000 words that you've taken in today and dozens of gigabytes of information that you've taken into your brain, what will you remember tomorrow? That's the standard.
So, what are the 6 steps? What's the framework?
Well, the essence of it is to first drop into, as I said, drop into how the world was. First, it's to time travel, to really go back into time, into that key moment. Maybe that moment's been nagging at you, and go to the day before. What were things like the day before? So, first one's time travel, is to reconstruct time and look back and see what that moment was. Use sensory details. Some memory experts say 2 to 3 sensory details often sets the scene. So you create a field with yourself and your audience so that it creates that kind of parallel existence that you can recognize and feel where they were. The second part is note note the journey. So excuse me, note the journey. So actually go in and acknowledge when that journey began. What was the transformation? What was the discovery? What did you come to as a result of that? The third part is get lost. And so by get lost, I mean too often leaders are focused on what they know. And the problem with always walking into a presentation or a keynote or a media conversation with what you know is that it can often be very boring. Explanations are not don't have the brain science accompanying them. It doesn't. There's no dopamine. There's no cortisol. There's no oxytocin. Those kind of connective hormones that actually create the memory encoding that we need to remember these stories. And so the getting lost part is what Joseph Campbell called the innermost cave. It's the place of transformation. It's the winter in your story. And so the opportunity is to really recognize in this moment that we're talking about, in this change from your life or from your organization, to allow yourself for a moment to just be in the not knowing. And that helps your audience also to be with you in that place of not knowing. Sometimes it can be a little bit uncomfortable to be on stage or to be presenting and be not knowing, but it's followed by the spring in your story. And that's the fourth point, which is the depth of your message, that true insight and how you convey it, that until finally moment. The key about this is where people often go straight to. They go straight to the big insight. We want to explain to you, we want to share the data. share why this is really important. And the problem is, per the point before, it's not encoded in memory. It's not something that tomorrow, with all the noise they're taking in today, this is not the thing that your audience is going to wake up with as they have their first cup of coffee. So the key is really landing that message. And to land that message, I always like to say, let's ask the 5 whys when you consider a story. That is, why does it matter? Second one is, why does it really matter? Third one is, actually, I'm not kidding. Why does it matter? And then the fourth one, you're getting a little bit of the tone here. The fourth one is, actually, why does it matter? And then the fifth one, you know what the answer is, which is, not kidding. Everybody stop. Everything stop. Why does it matter? The point of doing that exercise to get to the until finally moment, or that key insight, is that you are going to come up with different answers and different responses to that question. And you won't necessarily get to the ultimate one at the end, but you want to mix it up and not be held down to what you think this story is about. um the fifth point is, know your theory of change. So if you are, whether it's a keynote, whether it's a story, whether it's a presentation, you want to know that kind of deeper why as you come into your to develop the change. You want to depict that theory of change, and that theory of change usually comes in 3 steps, which I can drop into later. And the sixth part is to actually anchor the change. So the whole journey is about change. If you have no change in your story, there's no story. The sixth part is really about anchoring change. It's about what are the steps that you do to convey that change. It's much more about story living than it is about storytelling, as you know, from a kind of activist perspective or a sustainability perspective. It's, what are you living every single day to convey, to build on that change, to further it, to network around it, to deepen the message, to get it out in 10 different directions.
So, how did you come up with all this?
After the last time that we collaborated, which was a really great collaboration, working with ChicoBags and to create the gorilla in the greenhouse animation that we were developing for kids. That was a kind of culmination of 13 or 14 years in the digital world. And I, one day, after about the year after that, I was standing with my newborn daughter in our garden in Berkeley, and I was doing a little life intake, reflecting on what was the real impact of my of my life, and what were the key insights that I had, and why have I done this work. And I really came back to the times of my travels in my 20s, where I spent a fair bit of time going overland across South America and Southern Asia, and learning French in a little ski town in France, and learning to be a writer, and really devoted myself to language and travels. And as I was sitting there holding my daughter like I used to, kind of like a little bowling pin, she was about a month old at that time. I realized that it's that traveler's commerce, that those stories that we share by the side of the road, at a cafe, on a ride, in a hotel or a hostel, those stories that we exchange about our lived experiences were the ones that really stuck with me. And I really missed that. And I never really saw the internet delivering on these essential bits of wisdom. I mean, I've got 5,622 uh, pictures in my phone, but where are my most essential, let's say my 8 key insights and my stories from my life? Where do they live? I mean, how about for you, Andy? Where do your most essential stories of your life live? Not just one, but the whole
Mhm.
collection.
Probably just in my head.
Probably in your head, right. And
Yeah.
so and that's what I found. I realized, like, I wanted to bring that to this world, to these leaders, these change makers, these people that see a new world, and they have, whether it's a team of one or a whole, a team of 1,000, to bring that vision to life. It's those lived stories that were really untended. And so it's been a 16-year journey. Part of to your question of how I learned these specific bits um, was basically I set out to write a book a couple years after that. Most grueling thing probably ever done. And I gave myself 6 weeks, and it only took me 4.5 years. Um, and in that time, I was really, I have to admit, I was really surprised at how that writing process really can hone a person, not just hone the work, but hone really when you iterate and edit. I had 183 edits in my first chapter. I looked, and it can really hone those key points. So, I've since then I became a keynote speaker and I traveled the world, coaching CEOs and movement leaders on how to tell stories. And part of the most fun is guiding audiences to connect with each other. That's what I really love to do. And to hone those stories together, not just with a kind of one guide telling you how to do it, because they live inside of us. But we, like you said, really, when you go back and hone them and shape them, ask yourself again, what was the key point of that? Not from Andy in, 1993, but Andy now, right? Not just Jay in 2016, but Jay now. Why does that matter today? Why does it matter for this point? Why does it matter for this audience? And so to go through that crafting and shaping process, it informs a constellation not just of your stories, but of you and who you are and where you're going.
I like that. I think it's pretty powerful to look back at situations. I know I've looked back at situations in my life and looking at the situation from where I stand now with the knowledge and the wisdom that I have now, looking at that 6-year old, me, trying to understand this and the stories I was telling myself at that time of those experiences, I could see it totally different now, being a parent, having, the number of years I have under my belt, which totally changed the story for me.
Ab-
So yeah.
ab- Absolutely. And I have to say, parenting is, excuse me, parenting is one of the best places to hone your stories because, first of all, I mean, I'll tell you, my 3-year-old daughter knew more about stories than I had lived in my whole life because it's such a natural elemental biology that comes in. We're looking for that dopamine and that cortisol and that transformation, that gift, that act of love, that oxytocin that wraps it up. And nowadays we have too much cortisol. We're just like cortisol, cortisol, cortisol. And so it's part of our job, of our opportunity to deliver on these transformational components and to offer something of ourselves, not just hide behind titles and roles in books and things we've done, but to innovate based in what we know now to be true, and to bring that and apply it to these key acts of what the world needs now.
the It's interesting. You mentioned dopamine, and I've been thinking a lot about dopamine because we're getting these dopamine hits all day, and a lot of it isn't earned.
Yeah,
It's like, oh, you're scrolling on your phone, and like, oh, dopamine, dopamine. Oh, I got some
yeah,
more, but it doesn't. It's not sticking, right?
yeah,
It's not. I can't tell. I'm like, yeah, maybe that was a funny video. Maybe I can retell it, but none of it sticks. But
yeah,
you're talking about stories that stick, and I would call that earned dopamine. It's the same kind of dopamine you get when you climb to, the top of a mountain and you're like, yeah, I did it. You get a dopamine hit, you feel good. I imagine that storytelling is similar, that when you're connecting with someone, hearing a story, you're getting this dopamine hit, not just because of the story, but also because of the connection. Am I on the right track here?
well, there's so many different ways to explore this, but I would say I would connect dopamine with curiosity.
Okay.
So I think you're right with your phone. It's like, oh, what's that? What's that? What's that? Right. A lot of times we're seeing now, it's like, oh, the greatest thing that he ever said. And then you click it and it's like, brr, nothing. right? It was just a total just phishing scam, basically, not
Clickbait.
phishing, but
Yeah.
like, yeah, you're trying to like, it's a scam. And so more eyeballs, more success. That's not how I look at it. I look at it, I'm practicing this and seeing my clients practice this, and the school that I've launched, bringing people together, bringing leaders together to truly share not just their one story, because we think a lot about this now. We think, oh, yeah, tell your story, as if there's only one, right? The thing is, your story is made of what? Your story is made of stories. They're just kind of nestled in there, right? I'm sure you've done the Chico Bags story 1,000 times, right? But in the little kind of crags, there's these key bits that we often don't break out and say, hey, actually, the real reason why I did this part was because of this. And that starts to build trust. Like, that's one of the things here is authenticity, being real, building trust, connectivity. It's not just impact and memorability, right? Those are kind of the front loaded benefits, but so that's where you go dopamine. And this is where the journey curve comes in. The framework that I've distilled from these many masters is like, it's basically like a summer, fall, winter, spring, kind of like I alluded to. Comes up here. Summer, fall, winter, spring. And in that, you've got dopamine that draws us into the journey. Oh, then I discovered that. I started to think about this. I researched this, and then I realized this part. But then you come to that not knowing part, that innermost cave, that place of mystery. And that's where you go, actually, what I found was the real challenge was this. And then we're really kind of lost, right? Because you're like, but how the heck are you ever going to accomplish that? And that's where the deep journey, it's like from the innermost cave moment of your story, that winter moment, that not knowing, into that until finally moment. It might look like it's tiny. It might look like a quarter-inch journey, but oh boy, I mean, that could be either, it could take 5 minutes or it could take 5 years to get through from that not knowing into that knowing part. And that's how you get out of the cortisol, right? Meaning, and take How I Built This. You ever listen to How I Built This, the podcast? Great
Yes.
podcast about entrepreneurship, right? Um, and so they drop into that, like, then you knew what the real opportunity was, but then you had to raise that money, or you had to convince that one donor, or you had to get that one partner, and how it's basically totally impossible, except that it happened. And this is how you got through. And so that connection point, as one of my friends says, oxytocin eats cortisol, right?
Yep.
Oxytocin eats cortisol. So what we're getting a lot of times is just the cortisol, and we're overloaded with cortisol. But you need to have that love hormone, that connectivity, that ah, where everybody comes through the story in order to anchor in memory, in order to deliver on transformation, and in order to deliver on trust, which is the key missing factor out in the world today, because we've got all of these things which were supposed to connect us, but they don't. And that's what I'm finding every day with the people I work with the communities that I'm building, is that the foundation of it in being real, not just for being real sake, not just being vulnerable for being vulnerable sake, but to convey something relevant and essential and transformational for the moment in a way that creates that connectivity. And I'm astounded at the level of trust that is being cultivated as a result of it.
So I would love to hear, like, you walk me through this story curve. So you're talking about summer, fall, winter to spring. You're talking about brain chemicals. Not everyone understands, all these chemicals that you're mentioning. So can you walk us through the fall, or the what's it? It starts with spring, fall, winter. Sorry, summer's fall, winter, spring, right? So summer is that moment you talked about before something happens,
Yeah,
right?
that's right. Things were pretty good. That was a good moment. Wow, I remember, and then something happens.
And that's the fall.
That's the then one day of the story. So if we look at a story in three main changes, then one
Yeah,
day until finally, and ever since then, the curve kind of follows through there, right? So yeah, you're
got it.
riding along and boy, it's sunny and it feels pretty good. And then this thing happens, whether it's a problem, a loss, an insight, a recognizing that the world isn't like you thought it was, a new opportunity. And that leads you down and down into fall, down into that discovery. Click, I learned that. Click, I fell on that. Click, I met that person. Click. And that's also kind of it's fractal because you can use this for your keynote also. That's where your data goes too. People are always wondering, well, what's the relationship between data and story? Well, your data goes inside your story to support its journey, right? So then I discovered this key point, and that's where we get to the winter, right? Because from all of this discovery comes another problem,
Yeah,
which is that you now see the world differently. And now the challenge is greater than you could have ever imagined. And now you know what you need to do, but you don't know how to do it. And so that's where I mean that place of not knowing, where it's just like, I'm also a fan of, especially in stage work, I'm a fan of making use of the pause. I'm really not afraid on the stage to stand there for 5 seconds in silence. It has a kind of focusing effect.
yeah,
And so in that moment of loss, that moment of, and I am saying loss, but it's the loss of direction, the uncertainty, the how the heck is this ever possibly going to happen? We're in one of those moments on a grand scale right now, right?
yeah.
So then there you are, and then something brings you through. Is it something that somebody told you once that finally makes sense? Is it a friend who calls at the right time with the right opportunity? Is it something that you read that just turns you kind of 3%, right? Like the Apollo mission was constantly off by 3 degrees, right? Constantly off, constantly. That's the same as life. It's like it's not, we're not talking about a 180. We're talking about a 3 degrees turn. And you're like, oh my gosh, what's that? And you have a path to follow. And before you know it, you're through. And the fact is that the reason why I like to put these in seasons, because then the spring is here, right? Meaning, when will that sprout finally come? When will we finally see that sprout? Like, all of our ancestors, whatever culture you come from, gave a deep prayer for that possibility that we would make it through, that the food would grow again. Like, it's in our genes, everybody. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. And so that prayer, that hope, that aspiration, that pause, that being lost, before you come through that inkling and the sprout comes, and then we're in spring, you're not done. The journey's not done. You still have to go all the way back through harvest, right? You have to go all the way. You have to still do all the cultivation. You still have to lay down that approach. You still have to bring the cycle through. But the key is that this art of transformation. This is the craft of change in your life. So we can talk about stories, right? We can talk about where your 8 essential stories are, but we can also just say, where were the key changes in your life? It's just another way of saying it. And those key changes just may not be told, or maybe they're told in the way that Andy tells them when he was 6, right? Still hung to that naturally, still hung to that same meaning that existed a year ago or 10 or 20 years ago. And so the problem with that is that you're not the same as you were then. So why would the story be the same?
So the stories keep evolving as you grow and as your story evolves, your book of stories evolves as well.
Absolutely. And this is the same thing for an organization. So if your story is made of stories on a individual level, on a leadership level, then as an organization, it's even more so. Your story is made of stories. This is not about, type up the mission on the wall and have everybody repeat it at cocktail hour. This is about, what is the key transformation that you're delivering on, and how are you as a team member a part of it. How does your transformation build to that transformation? And how is that 3 degrees of shift towards that end goal? How is that happening every day? And what did you do today? What's your story today about how that nested transformation is is being born?
So I have a number of questions coming up. One is like, well, how does an organization go about crafting their story? The second question I have is, well, um, once you have your story, like how do you tell it, in a way like that gets it out there? Is it a different story for employees versus customers? Is it all the same story? Can you and you have a lot of experience working with organizations, helping them craft their story. Can you walk us through kind of what that looks like and maybe some of the mistakes that you see people make in regard to storytelling?
Yeah. So my first statement is 1,000 in and 1,000 out. So you really want to do a landscape study. You want to know what are what are the stories of each of your, for example, each of your key employees or each of your employees. What was the story that brought them here? Right? So again, and when I say story, I'm using a very specific word. I'm not just like, hey, what's the thing you say? I mean, what is the problem that you faced, that you created a transformation or came through a transformation to anchor change, right? It is a journey of change. So when I say, what's your story? I mean, what was the summer, right? Like, what was it like the day before you got the call? Or,
Yeah.
so you start in how the world was, and then you come into the key change, and then you drop into that moment of not knowing. Well, guess what? From an employee standpoint, and this is just one lens, this is can be more of a culture lens, right? But it's also a product lens, because once you get to that until finally moment, well, from a job standpoint, from a why do you work here, everybody's going to have the same until finally, because that's going to be the day I got the job. So then it's called dovetailing journey curves. So you basically have all these inputs to that same kind of landing place. And you can do a little story math. You can gather those and do a little cloud, story cloud work and say, okay, well, it's interesting. There's 6 main reasons why people come here. Now there's a whole nother exercise, which is to say, tell me a story about something that makes you stay here, right? Whole
Yeah.
nother collection. And those are interesting for a different reason, because those also illuminate your values, but they also come with these surprises, right? Like, oh, here's the thing that happened the other day where I met with this guy, or, so and so actually did this thing, and you end up featuring and modeling. And so I support organizations on that front. Again, it is that can be more of a kind of culture or belonging path, but it's a way of people seeing each other where they don't see each other. So you
Yeah.
can, for team meetings, okay, somebody tell a story. Now you have to give them a little baseline on what we mean by story. Can grab the journey curve off the web. It's got, different framework to inform you. But like another approach, okay, employee stories, right? What was your experience in the product? This is not a review. This is not a quote. This is, how was your life before ChicoBag? How was your life when it happened, and what has changed? And then you start to, again, it's kind of story math. Like, wow, we're seeing that these changes are just like that. This is why these people keep coming back. And so, yeah, people ask about AI storytelling a lot. And I will say you have to be very, very careful, but the power is immense, right? The danger is that it ends up telling somebody else's story because it doesn't know you. But in this example, it's a great use of AI. Go gather 100 stories, call out for 100 stories, give them a little framework. You have to say it twice because people don't register. They're like, oh, yeah, my story. My story is yesterday I met a guy. It was really cool. No, not a story. No change. So it's you have to prod a little bit to really get the data. And because the data comes in the delta, but
Yeah.
gather 100 of those stories. You can also build tools to support that. My main point is, if you can, it's not an impossible task to gather those stories. Then you run them through Claude. say, Claude, help distill what what's the meta story here, right? Now, I'm not putting myself out of a job because you've always got challenges and you always want to have filters. But I think it's a fun application to distill stories using AI. I also think that's part of the work that we do is like gathering them, distilling, finding example stories. Then you said, obviously this is a big topic, but then you said, well, how do you use them? So part of how you use them is you're conveying your meta story, your about story, your you're socializing it among your team in a way that is original, not just like tell this story, but tell the story in a way that impacts you. Tell the story that feels relevant to you. Tell your version of the story, right? It's going to be the same delta. It's going to be the same change, but it's going to be related to you. And then out in the world, then you've got a ton of social media opportunities to give these little nuggets of change, whether it's from employees or from customers. Excuse me for my cough. Um, and then you've got these little nuggets that you can use in social media. And then you also have a kind of greater recognition of what the transformation is that you're delivering on every day. We could do a day on this topic. I'm happy to.
Well, I know you do. So, I mean, we have a certain amount of a time here, and I certainly want the listeners to get a really good understanding of what makes a good story, and maybe how do you know when you're telling a bad story, or you're not telling a complete story, or that not a retellable story, like how um
Yeah, let me run through a few bits, a bit of restating of the kind of stick
and
points you
maybe
wrote.
some examples of like the same story told poorly and then told in a way that's retellable.
My daughter, when she was 3, I was saying she used to love stories, and I would tell her the 3 pigs story. And the only way I found that I could do it, because unlike our son, she didn't like the quiet whisper stories. She really liked the loud stories. So my wife would come in and say, "What the heck are you doing?" I'm practically yelling at her, you know. And then there was the wolf, and then he came and he couldn't believe it. There was this house of bricks, and he goes on, and I'm just fully, and she thought I was crazy. I was like, no, no, you just watch. And that was what rallied her to go to sleep. Still does. She's 16. So the key there is that if there was a day where I was really tired and I was just really exhausted. I couldn't tell another story. I couldn't, and I just said, and then there was the 3 pigs, and then there was a wolf, and then he went up into the chimney and he burnt his butt and he had to run away, and that's the end of the story. And she turns to me, 3 years old, and she says, "Dad, that is not a story." And I was like, Mr. Story, here I am. I'm the guy of story. And I'm like, huh, okay, you're totally right. It wasn't a story. Well, what was lacking? It comes back to those 3 things, right? Basically, I went from the dopamine right to the oxytocin. I skipped over the detail. So that's one of the problems, is that people think, and I've done tons of work I've worked in the Fortune 10 sector. I've worked with some of the most radical activists. I worked with all different kinds of faith-based organizations. I've a whole diversity of folks. I get all the time, I get this. People don't have time to hear a story. They don't have time. I got this a lot. I did a lot of work at Google. They don't have time. And I want to just tell you that I don't think people have time to not hear a story. And that means the idea is I'm going to take their time from them. I should just tell them the facts. And that's fine. You tell them the facts so that goes into their Twitter brain. And tomorrow they're going to forget all of them. Right. So that's doing
Yeah.
them a favor to tell them something that's on the facts that they're going to forget. So yeah, you got to take a little risk. You got to take them a little left turn first. You got to be bold and courageous and say,
See,
I want to tell you a story. There was a day, da da da. And then you got to land the message. And when you land the message, it's going to go in. And if you don't believe me, tell me about your kids.
mine, I have an
Yeah.
11-year-old.
11-year-old, boy, girl.
A girl, 11-year-old girl.
Now, uh, so you tell me. So 11's getting to that age where it's very hard to kind of start breaking through. Maybe it's about to come, but like I'll tell you, sometimes I sit down with my daughter today and I don't tell her I need to tell you something. I say, when I was 16 years old, I always choose like 2 years over them. This is
Yeah.
just kid story, but like it sneaks in. That's why it's no mystery that all of our great books are woven with story. It's not because it's nice, it's because it's how you carry information. So you don't have time to not tell a story, but when you take that time, drop them into the cave, get lost and get found.
Okay, it's starting to stick now. So if you're going to say something that you want people to remember, you got to tell them a story. You got to create this basically mental stickiness of using emotion, getting, the chemicals to start flowing so you can hook the story onto things so that it sticks in there. Otherwise, it's just going to go, it's not going to stick.
Yeah, it goes right into where all the other information and all the other data goes. And you're asking about what's not a story. I'll tell you what's not a story, okay? Because
Yeah.
people use this word again, very fuzzy. Um, about 10 years ago, I decided, man, I could really drop 10 pounds. I don't know how to do it. I keep on wanting to do. And then I went and and I exercised more and I really decided I cut down on what I was eating. And gosh, it just didn't really change. And then I went to an expert and then it really didn't change. It's not a
Yeah.
story. It's not a story. There's no change, right? That's what people say. Oh, that's just your story. That's how they use it. That's where we get a problem is because they're not talking about the same thing. And I respect, like, I get it. It's the rattle in your brain, the problem you have. That's just what gets you into the cave. When I say story, it's the thing that gets you into the cave and the thing that gets you out of the cave. That's how we learn. That's how we connect. That's how we build authenticity and trust and learning and shared insight. And that's how we guide.
And then the last part, that's how what?
That's how we guide. That's how we guide people. You don't guide
Guide.
them by just giving them problems that were never solved. That's
Yeah.
boring.
Yeah. I mean,
Like,
because
hey,
instantly I'm looking for like, well, and what's the
yeah,
rest of it?
that was a joke. That was a joke. It's like it's a it's like, oh, and then I wanted to go start running, and then I went out and I tried and I just didn't do it, and I never did it. Okay, thanks. Am I going to go retell that tomorrow? Yeah, this guy told me this amazing story about when he wanted to become a marathoner, but all he did was a mile. No, no, because there's no cortisol there. There's no transformation. We're looking for that winter into spring. Now, look, if you've got a story or a unhealed story that you need to tell your friends, tell your therapist, you got to work it out. Honor, total appreciate. Not all stories are ready to tell, but let's
Yeah.
not confuse unresolved problem for a transformational story.
So tell me more about the brain chemicals because you're throwing out dopamine, cortisol, oxytocin. So where are those? What seasons are those in? What part of the story are those released? And what does it mean exactly?
Yeah. So I talked about dopamine as curiosity. It's the thing that opens you up, that makes you begin to lean in a little bit. Cortisol is the stress hormones. Cortisol is like when you hear a screech and you're driving your car and you hear a screech up close. That's cortisol. That makes you focus your attention. That's when
Yeah.
people lift cars off of people, right? Cortisol is what focuses your attention, focuses your adrenaline. That's the innermost cave. That's when people are like, and then I lost everything. Well, if that was the end of the story, we just kind of walk out kind of sad,
Yeah.
right? It happens, it's real, but like this isn't the forum for that, right? And so
Yeah.
that's the cortisol. Now, too much cortisol is PTSD, literally. Too much cortisol, looping cortisol, PTSD. I think everybody's kind of got their version of that these days, right? But that's why oxytocin, which is like, when it comes from sex, it comes from birth, it comes from, a warm hug. Oxytocin is what then takes us through decreases the cortisol and creates the connectivity. So now you have the whole flow: curiosity, focus, attention, connection.
Got it. So those you need all three of those in a good story.
Yes.
And when you're talking about what happened before in the summer period, you need to use, you said, at least two or three different sensory things. So like taste or smell, touch.
Yeah. Use at least two or three when you're setting. So you should set a scene three, two or three different times where you drop them, make a little movie. You don't want to give them 10 scenes in a story, but give two or three. And when you do, give two or three sensory details. So not just there I was in the trees, but rather the texture of the fuzzy outer of the redwood tree reminded me of, my favorite rug from when I was a child. The salty sea air began to waft into my nose. The blue sky was being just barely covered in fog. Now you might think, oh, what am I doing, Whitman? I'm not. I'm enacting your ability to recognize this exact field, whether or not you've ever been in a redwood grove.
That's powerful. I could see the power, and it's funny because I didn't learn this in school. It seems like a critical skill that we all need to know to do life well.
Agreed. Agreed. And I think that we all have that from a leadership standpoint, from an organizational standpoint, and certainly from a and certainly from a movement standpoint. We need to orient ourselves into new possibilities, and we need to cultivate trust across barriers.
So people can use this, in their family, personal life, in their business, in their organization. Um, and you teach this, right? You have consulting, you teach classes. How can people get in touch with you or get access to some of the resources that you provide?
Yeah, thank you. You can check out my website. Just put up a new updated website after several years, retellable.com. And it's got a lot of insights from different folks and different the different offerings that we do, from coaching to training to keynote speaking, and the new School of Legend that we just launched, which is really creating teaching a teaching community and a collaborative environment, which we just launched in Orange County. Um, and check out my book, retellable.com. You can also follow me on LinkedIn. I do a lot of put up a lot of my new thoughts and insights, and I keep plugging away at my next book, and I'll kind of keep sharing those insights. But really, the essence of it is, how do we dream a new dream?
That's your new book. How do we dream?
Yeah, well, it's kind of about change the dream. It's like
Okay.
and what's the role of story? What's the role of story living to that? Not just the stories that we tell, but the big stories that we live. And how do we hold those, change them, recalibrate them to inform a new future?
Well, I can't wait to read it. And thank you for all the resources. I'll put them in the show notes so other people can access them. And thank you, Jay, so much for your time and your wisdom.
It's an honor. I'm glad to be connected, and let's stay linked as we sometimes drive down that I-5 towards the Bay Area. And I appreciate all your devotion and your good work, and appreciate your product. I'm glad to be connected. Thank you, Andy.
Yeah. Thank you, Jay.
All right.